For this day, opportunity we have to be gathered with you, and thank you for watching over us and just help to get this AC fixed, and continue to thank you for what you provide and continue to sustain us. We just ask you to continue to guide and direct us and look into your word. Help us to be focused on you and eliminate the distractions, and thank you for what you are doing and continue to do, and helping us to see and understand and be guided and directed by you, and to just be changed by you and your word. Thank you for all you give on the insight, and continue to help and grow us into your word. And we thank you for all you do. In Jesus, Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. Again, we're going to probably be interrupted as we were last week because the AC is out again. We got 45 minutes of being ignored again. So I don't know what's going on here, but it's really difficult to, believe in people that don't do their jobs. Emergency service doesn't even acknowledge your request. So anyway, that's where we're at. And so it was 85 and now it's 83. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not sure if it's working at all or what. I don't know. So you don't want to leave this open because the AC flows better when it's hot. So leave that open. Anyway. All right, so I'm kind of, just to be honest with you, I'm hot and bothered and kind of frustrated. This is 2 weeks in a row now. So God's testing me, and I'm not passing too well on this. So we were going to go through the actual review of Noah's Ark and take that from a date standpoint into other aspects of the patriarchs and into the times of Moses. And so what I want to do is to go back and kind of review some things to remind us where we're at with the Noah's Ark, and then segue that into this next piece, and also tie in some things that are extra biblical knowledge, the things that aren't in the Bible that people, historians, and other people like Josephus have mentioned about the events surrounding Noah's Ark time frame. So the first thing I want to make sure we kind of go back to is that Sister Laney mentioned about the raven and the dove. So I want to bear repeating that with the raven going out first, and he's a type of Elijah who he went out and returned later. If you remember the raven, it says that in chapter 8 of verse 6, and they opened the window of the ark, in which he made and sent forth the raven, verse 7, and the waters went, and he went to and fro until the waters were dried up from off the earth. So he went to and fro until the waters dried up. So he did come back, but not until the waters were dried up off the earth. So he came back later, speaking to Elijah, who did not come back initially, but comes back later as a witness, obviously, in the tribulation period. We also know that the raven being sent out alone is a picture of Elijah, who was alone after the prophets of Baal were dealt with, and then he actually was alone being fed by the ravens in the desert. Then the dove was sent out at the same time to go look after the raven, and that's the two witnesses typology from Moses and Elijah. And the dove is more Moses, because Moses is a type of Christ, and Christ and the dove are correlated because of the Holy Spirit being the dove who ascended down in his baptism. And so you have the dove going out in 7 days, coming back, and then coming back, and then 7 days later going out. And then, so you had two different times the dove went out. He went after the raven. Within, I would say, the raven didn't come back that night. Then he went out, didn't find him. 7 days later, Noah lets him out again, and then 7 days later again. So he brings back the olive branch 7 days later, then brings him out again, doesn't come back. So why did he send him out 2 times? Because he wanted to make sure that the earth had enough dryness, because olive branches are not on the level. They're on the side of a ridge of a mountainside. He wanted to make sure there was no standing water from which to get off the ark, to make sure there was no problems with opening the door up, having water come on, and things like that. So you can have olive branches above the water level, but there was still water on the earth. So he sent the dove out a second time to make sure if there was no water at all. And the 2 groups of 7 days, if you look into the scripture, for example, when he says, I'll get your question. He says, and in verse 10, he stayed another 7 days and again sent forth the dove, and the dove came into him in the evening and with an olive branch in his mouth. And then in verse 12, Noah, in verse 8, chapter 8, verse 12, and Noah went, and the waters were abated off the earth, and he stayed yet another 7 days and sent forth the dove, which returned no more. The 2 7-day periods represent the time out ahead. With both times, Moses was before a time of entrance into the promised land. After a time of judgment, Exodus, Moses stood between judgment and promised land entrance, and there's Moses, the type of the dove, flood, and promised land. While there's 2 7 days, because Moses comes back again, as we know, tribulation is behind us. When he shows up, you're going to have, at the end of it all, tribulation will have been behind us, and then you'll have the ahead of us, the promised land of day 7, the Messianic reign. So that's why there's 2 groups of 7 representing Moses' dove typology, that he represents 2 times after a time of judgment. There will be entrance into the promised land. One was a typology of Canaan promised land, and then the other one will be the promised land, the day of Christ, the Messianic reign, which is the type of the promised land, looking forward to that day. So, you had a question, sorry, or a
I
comment?
was thinking the 2 groups of 7 days reminds me of 2 groups of 7 years with Joseph, and also the first and second advent of Christ.
Yeah, the two. Yeah. So there's the first, second advent of Christ. You also have the 2 days, day 7 and day 8. Yeah. So it speaks to a lot of different things. But I think day 7 being God's complete number. I think it always from the typology aspect speaks to God's complete judgment 2 times. Where in Moses' day he completely judged and separated Jew from Egyptian. Of course, the mixed multitude left, but he separated them from that place, that land. But then we're going to go into today other things that are extra biblical as well as date-wise in relation to this. So Josephus mentions that when Shem, blessed be the line of Shem, and because of that statement, blessed be the line of Shem, and of course we saw Nimrod in verse of chapter 10 of Genesis and verses 8 and 9, that he was a mighty hunter. As you fast forward that tape, we see that this was the time when they say, well, Shem, and Josephus comments on this, and so there's extra Jewish literature, that Shem beheaded Nimrod. And they say that he beheaded Nimrod as a type of the strength and power and blessing that God had on Shem's line over that which is part of Ham's line. And so therefore, that was a precursor, they believe, to why David was key in beheading Goliath after he slew him with the rock in his head and knocked him unconscious. And if you read the story closely, David beheaded him, which is pretty profound, because if that's true, we don't know that in Scripture, but extra biblical information states that Shem did that. If that is true, they claim that was the leading to the disbursements of languages, because they say that Shem also dismembered him and spread about his body parts. Now, I don't know if that's completely accurate, but that's other things outside that state that from Josephus, and other biblical or extra biblical writings of Jewish history would mention this. So again, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's interesting to think about that did Shem in fact become the demise of Nimrod? And if that's the case, it wouldn't be the first time when we saw David slaying Goliath one-on-one. That would mean that Shem was the first one to slay a giant one-on-one, which also brings up the question, as I mentioned, with when Goliath was around 10 feet tall, and you have this sword that he would have wielded, would have been quite the monstrous sword. And since David's a young man, how did he have the strength and wherewithal to do that? Because Saul's armor swam on him, and it just kind of like was too big for him. Remember that? So if he already was showing you that Saul, being a big man, his armor was too heavy and too big for David, how much would his sword then be to handle, let alone Goliath's sword? So how did he wield that? Unless it was supernatural power from God, which makes me think that if Shem did do this, if it is true, there had to be supernatural power from God. It wasn't something that was just his own physical strength, if it is true. So I don't know that, but I think it's just interesting thought to think about that. Yes?
Isn't it connected with that Semiramis and Tammuz thing? I think it's in Ezekiel, they're weeping for Tammuz or Isaiah. And maybe the Semiramis or whatever is like the Nana, and the Tammuz might be the Nimrod.
I don't know. I don't know about that whole. There's a lot of tie, they believe, to Nimrod having some vestige of how in that book you had me reading too. He actually believes that Nimrod has a tie to the beginnings of Freemasonry, and why he was the guy that because he was building this big ziggurat or Tower of Babel, they believe he was the first builder, master craftsman, and then they factor their belief system around him. Interesting. Yes?
Lainey said thanks for going over that again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Vicky had asked what's making the AC crash.
Don't know when we're being ignored once again, and they don't seem to care. So they told us the property was sold on Monday. Nice to tell us, right? So that just means they don't care about the process of emergency fixing of things, and they're not fulfilling under the bargain. And I need to have a meeting with the owners and to have this all mapped out. So you saw this coming, They made their money and they're gone. That's what they do. It's typical American mentality sometimes with corporate people. They want to get their profits and leave. I hate to say that, but it's just true a lot. Not all the time, but a lot. So anyway, so when you have this phrasing here with, going back to Genesis, sorry, not topic with that, but Genesis, we saw also that before chapters 10 and Nimrod coming out, we saw that these whole line of people, I want to show you something else in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16. I want to kind of put out some things here to make you, I saw this, thought it was interesting. Remember we mentioned the comment that Ham's line and Shem's line commingled? So if you read from Ezekiel chapter 16 and verses 1 through 3, it it's interesting what he says here. And he says, then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, testify against Jerusalem and her iniquities. And you shall say, thus saith the Lord to Jerusalem, your root and pedigree is from the land of Canaan. Your father was an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite. What? It's rather interesting where God in Ezekiel is telling Jerusalem they were birthed out of the land of Canaan, and their father is an Amorite, and their mother is a Hittite. You're like, what? I thought Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the God of Israel. And Abraham came from the Ur of the Chaldees. He wasn't an Amorite. What are you talking about? He was Chaldean. So what do you mean? I don't understand, right? And so what he's talking about here, as you remember, Lot from nephew to Abraham, Haran's son, he went later on to have his daughters have incest with him, and the Amorites and the Moabites came out of him, right? So out of Lot came the Amorites from his daughter's relationship to him. So remember how the Lord said within Abraham's loins was the priesthood? Well, that would therefore mean in the loins of Lot was the Amorites. And so you would therefore say, since Abraham became like a surrogate father to Lot, God in some crazy, strange way, I don't understand it all. I just know that he's telling us here in Ezekiel 16, 1 and 3, that he says the pedigree is that the father was an Amorite from Jerusalem, that is, their father of Jerusalem is Amorite, and the mother is a Hittite. Well, the Hittite part comes in where you have the servants of Jacob. Remember Zilpah and Bilhah. And they were the two servants who had other children unto Jacob, because Leah and Rachel had their own handmaidens, Zilpah and Bilhah, respectfully. And sons of Israel came from those handmaidens. And many would say those handmaidens were akin to Hagar. And since Hagar was a servant of Egypt that Abraham took in and had Ishmael with, they then would infer, it's not in the Bible, but people infer that Zilpah and Bilhah were probably Hittite because of this passage. This passage in Ezekiel 16, 1 and 3, 1 through 3 says Jerusalem's mother was a Hittite. So which means we do know some of the children of Israel came from two servants that were not of the kindred line of Laban, which was Rachel's brother, Jacob's uncle. So when he married Leah and Rachel, his cousins, that was his bloodline, the same kindred, but the two servants were not. And it's very clear that the servants were not of the same kindred, they were always of different kindred, hence that's why they're servants. And so since Hagar was not of the same kindred, she was of Egypt, and Sarai was not, therefore they infer, extra biblical knowledge would infer, that they must have been Hittite, because given biblical knowledge, that there were servants, and Ezekiel 16, 1 and 3 says they were Hittite. So it kind of speaks to this whole issue back to Genesis that the Shem and Ham line have continuously been going on concurrently, and Ham has been polluting that line for a long time, so much so it made God say, not made God say, God said that Jerusalem's beginning was land of Canaan, father Amorite, mother Hittite. I find it interesting. I think it says more than interesting to have that said. Then you go back also to Genesis chapter 27. I want you to read something else regarding this issues of what happened in Noah's day and how these Hamite and Shemite line is contentious with each other, and how even the line of Abraham's blessing knew better than to intertwine with them. So look into Genesis in chapter 27 and the last couple of verses. And he says, then Rebekah said to Isaac, verse 46 of chapter 27 of Genesis, Rebekah says to Isaac, I am weary of my life on account of the daughters of the children. And I got to go back to this, sorry. In the Septuagint, it doesn't give the right terminology. The names are all, okay. So he says, for the daughters of Heth, I am weary because the daughters of Heth, such are these of which are the daughters of the land. What good shall my life do me? In verse 1 of chapter 28, and Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said unto him, you shall not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Like, hello. So they knew. Isaac knew right away from just a couple generations, and you got from Shem to Abraham's about 1,200 and change years. Now Abraham has Isaac, and Isaac knew well enough, which means Abraham knew to pass that down to him. You don't intermingle with this line of Shem. Don't do that. Because why would Isaac say that? Unless he knew the issue was at hand, that this was going to be a problem later on, but don't perpetuate it, right? So, yes.
Todd said in Ezekiel 16:8 that covering your nakedness is different than the Genesis passage about Noah. And before that, he asked, is Wawa still coming?
Yes. So yes, and so Exodus 16, and the question about the gas station is yes. So in Exodus 16, in verse 8 when he said, when I passed by thee and looked upon thee, and behold, thy time at the time of thy love, and spread thy skirt above thee, and to cover thy nakedness. Yeah. So yeah, this is a whole different, this is, again, the phrasing father's nakedness is what we're talking about from the Genesis passage. This is about Israel, and he's comparing Israel to, the whole passage of Ezekiel is fascinating to read, the whole entire chapter. Chapter 16 of Ezekiel is akin to Ezekiel 31. There's lots of issues in Ezekiel 31 that point to the Assyrian being the Antichrist, who is the beast who was in the Garden of Eden as a typology. But you read, there's those verses that are more powerful than others, but the entire chapter is like pivotal to then read Ezekiel 31, then go back and read Genesis 3 and see what really happened. Well, the same goes for Ezekiel 16. You read Ezekiel 16 in its totality, you're going to see, then go back and read Genesis chapter 10. And you're going to see a whole new world of like, oh my goodness. Now you're going to see why and how things happened. You can even go into reading chapter 11 as well. So, but chapter 10 particularly is the stories of the genealogies of, like the end of chapter 9, when the issue of what Canaan did unto his grandmother. So end of chapter 9 and in chapter 10 and a little bit of 11 until the genealogy of Shem comes around. You read that and you go, wow, okay, read Ezekiel 16. Then you read that and you're like, okay, there's a lot more here that happened than what was recorded in Genesis that Ezekiel's obviously speaking to that happened, because how else do you get these comments that in Jerusalem, your beginning was in Canaan, your father was an Amorite, and your mother was a Hittite? Where do you get that from? Unless, again, he's going back to some issues that were set in place, set in motion, that later on came to fruition. And as we see, that's exactly what happened. The Hamite and Shemite lines intermingled constantly, and you have, unfortunately, a demise that Ezekiel 16 speaks about. And it's not the coolest thing. This goes back to another thing, we're doing review of this, is going back to, so again, the nakedness of Ezekiel is about the sons of Israel, Israel as a whole, the whole peoples, all 12 tribes. He's comparing their idolatry, their mirroring. By the way, if you go into what they did, read this, just read the first couple, read the first 6 verses. You can read them all, but the first 6 verses are very poignant in Ezekiel 16 of what happens because of their interaction with him. Watch this, 16 verses 4, 5, and 6. And as for thy nativity, or your kindred, and the day you were born, thy navel was not cut, neither thou was washed in water to supple thee, nor was thou salted on, nor swallowed at all. None eye pitied you to do any of these unto you, to have compassion unto you, but that you were cast in the open field, to the loathing of thy person in the day thou was born. In other words, you weren't anything until I called you out. He's making them clearly known. You were nothing. You were an abandoned, sinful, depraved human like any other human. I made you into a special people. I made you into a uniqueness of humans. And then he says in verse 6, and when I passed by you, I saw that you were polluted in your own blood. And I said unto you, what's in thy blood live? And you said, unto you is in thy blood live. And then you keep reading a little bit longer, and he says that I have caused thee to multiply as the bud of the field, and as I increase the waxing great, you are come to an excellent of ornaments in thy breast are fashioned, thy hair is grown, and then whereas thou was naked and bare. And he goes on to talk about how these people, they basically trusted in their own outward show. They sacrificed their kids. They did things like unto the Canaanite people of the Ham line, who were totally wicked, and how they killed one another, and how they just were stuck on themselves in pride. And God says, but you were the same. No one was there when I called you. I called you out. You just remember, like when Jesus said it differently in the book of the Gospels, I can raise up stones. He was just making a different paraphrase by saying, look, when you were born, no one was there. I made you who you are. Your pedigree didn't make you who you are. I did. And he's making them clearly understand. Even after that, you continue to live like a horse's patoot, and you're buffoons living just like those of the Hamite line. And you wonder why I'm describing you as a harlot. In other words, if you left to your own devices, you'd have been the same polygamist, idol-worshiping, polytheist, ignorant, child-eating, child-sacrificing people as the Canaanites were. You'd have been the same way. That's what God's telling them in Ezekiel 16. You read the whole chapter, God's making it very clear, you would have been just like that if it wasn't for me. And then because of me, I give you blessings, and you do that anyways. That's what he's talking about in Ezekiel 16. He's just trying to let them know the contrast is, it looks like with or without me, you go back to your own devices and live ignorantly, evil, and wicked. And I'm not going to stand for it. This whole message in Ezekiel 16 is, I made you different to not go that way. Not to continue to go that way, which is insanity. Which is why, again, I wanted to read in Genesis where they knew better, but yet they still... So if Isaac tells Jacob not to take a wife of the Canaanites, you think he was putting forth the message among your own kindred, among your own kindred. Why would he know that? Because that's what Eleazar did under Abraham's guidance to pick out a wife for Isaac. The principle was clear, among your own kindred. Jacob knew that. So why you have another handmaiden of Rachel and Leah you're sleeping with? Why'd you do that? You just ruined it. You were the last one, God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Abraham kind of soiled the loins with having Ishmael, but at least the promise didn't come from Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac. No. So God made a way around that and said, that's just not smart. And I said Sarai. So he had Abram and Sarai had, okay, they had Isaac. Well then, Isaac and Rebekah, their own kindred, and Isaac says, okay, well, I don't want to do what Daddy did. That was wrong, because Daddy told him that was wrong. And he realized that was wrong. So he tells his son, based on what his granddad taught him, to tell him, don't choose outside your kindred. He particularly said Canaanite, which was the iconic representation of all that which is evil from Ham's line. He didn't mean just Canaan. He meant anybody from Ham's line. So Jacob knew that. So why do you have sons of two handmaidens from your kindred? What are you thinking? And you wonder why Israel from that point forward, because remember Jacob's name became Israel, and his sons of Israel are his 12 sons and his one daughter Dinah. So all those children he had are then from that point forward cursed always to have the line of Shem and Ham intermixed with their tribes. You can't get around it. That's why God says in Ezekiel 16, your father's an Amorite and your mother's a Hittite. Because he's saying, because in essence, you've basically married into that line. In essence, I look at your pedigree as no different than how I called you out to be different. Now you live just the same as you were if I wasn't intervening in your life. It's just ignorant.
Well, Rachel pressed him to do that. I mean, she's like, give me children or I die. She couldn't have children. She says, have them through the surrogate.
Yeah, it's true. But like the old adage, someone could manipulate and put forth the scenarios to your point for someone to, like Sarai did to Abram. Yeah. But still the choice is on, in this case, the person. No one held a gun to his head. No one said, do this or die. So they coerced it, they manipulated it, set these things in place. They owned some of that, but he ultimately made that choice. And Jacob should remember the resonating words of his father. Don't do that. Just like Abraham should remember the words of the father. I told you, you and your wife. But his wife was so convincing, Abraham slept with Hagar. So Rachel's love for Jacob was so great, Jacob's love for Rachel was so great, he coalesced to what Rachel said, to your point. So it just shows you how man is coalesced, manipulated. People say, I'm beyond reproach, like Peter would say, I would never deny you. All of us are susceptible. Even the greatest men of faith, Abraham and Jacob, were both influenced by those that they loved so greatly. Abram, Sarah, Jacob, Rachel, they were influenced, to your point, to lay with someone else they shouldn't have. They shouldn't have done it, which goes to the mind that, yes, a husband should listen to his wife and a wife her husband, but this goes to the context of, but if it's against God's will deliberately and clearly, you don't do it. You don't do it. Sorry, that's when you depart from the one flesh issue. You can't say, hey, honey, let's go do a crime together and commit a felony. No. The answer is no, I'm not doing that. We're not doing that. That's crazy. That's different than, no, don't be ignorant. So this is where Abram and Jacob, being men of faith, struggle with that issue. How do I love my one flesh, my wife, and yet she's telling me she wants something that is against what God said? What do I do? And they coalesce to the natural, fleshly, earthly issues. And I'm not saying women are the bad ones here. It's just humanity can influence another human, especially when you're one flesh. That husband-wife relationship can be used against you to do something that's not so good. And that's what God showed you in this relationship between Abram and Sarah that introduced Hagar, and then Jacob and Rachel introduced Bilhah, and of course with Leah, Zilpah. It's just not good. Yes?
And then Rachel died early because of the household gods.
Yeah, I know. Well, she gave birth to Benjamin and she died in that birth. But yeah, I know. She had household. Yeah, she had false. Yeah, she had false gods. She did. You're right. She brought some idols with her. So just kind of reference to you this passage is that I wanted you to see from how God was looking at Israel. So go back again to Genesis in chapter 10 again. So in chapter 10 of Genesis again. So to remind you of a couple of things in Genesis chapter 10 also. So we saw how, again, I mentioned in chapter 27 of Genesis, verse 46, Rebekah's concerned of the daughters of Heth, which is out of their kindred. She already has this concern because she knew. Isaac has a concern, tells Jacob, don't go that way of the Canaanites. Why would you say that? They're from the line of Ham. They knew. This was already, it's not like emphasized, but if you read Genesis, end of chapter 9 and chapter 10, you go, they knew more than what we're led on to understand. They knew a lot more than the Bible's telling us. And so obviously you don't go on saying statements like that unless you really know there's a high importance here, priority, to stay within your kindred. Abraham made the comment to Eleazar to get a wife for his own kindred, for Isaac. And then Isaac's telling Jacob the same thing, in essence, by not going to the Canaanites. Different verbiage. He didn't say stay within your kindred, but that pretty much is inferred when you use the iconic name representative of the curse of his line, which was then carried on through all the sons of Ham. He knows that. He was just the servant of those servants. And so you go back to also the Canaanites, again, those in Canaan. If you look at the history, this is what, again, you'll find is that people would say, in the Canaanites, out of the Canaanite region of giants that lived in that land, the following, I'll write on the board later, but these are the following they said were in this land: the Ammonites, the Hittites, the Moabites, the Midianites, the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Zidonians, the Sevarims, and the Perizzites. Those are the ones that were in Canaan at the time when they, cast them out, when they killed them, right? So there's some giants associated with those peoples, in other words, because of what the spies had said. They're like grasshoppers in their eyes. So one more passage I want to read to you is in reference to Psalm 106. And Psalm 106, regarding this issue of Ham and Shem's line, and getting off some takeaways from this. So in Psalm 106, I want you to see how, again, Shem's line affected the issue of Ham's line, or Ham's line affected Shem's line. Psalm 106, verse 34, he says, they did not root out the nations or the different ethnicities which the Lord had mentioned to them. Psalm 106, verse 34. Verse 35, they didn't root them out, so verse 35, they mingled with those ethnicities and learned their works. They sure enough did, didn't they? Verse 36, they served their graven images, which became to them a stumbling block. Verse 37, Psalm 106, they actually sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons. Are you kidding me? Verse 38, and they shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to graven idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with the blood and defiled by their works. And they went a-whoring with their devices. And now you get more of an intake of what God's talking about in Ezekiel 16, why he mentions them in a polluted sexual manner of basically playing the harlot, spiritually speaking, because that's what they did. So you can, when you compare Psalm 106, 34 to 38, you take in Genesis 28, 1. You take in Genesis 28. You take it all together from what God told them after the Exodus, and you go, wait a second. God is not too high on this Canaanite people, is he? Anybody who occupies Canaan land before they went into the Promised Land, not cool peoples. Matter of fact, God went a step further to even tell you, because of the intermingling with them, nothing but bad results. When you intermingle, bad comes of it. Now, this is where you have a lot of people that have bigotry and discrimination in our country and in our human history. They will say, they'll take this a step further and say, that's why every ethnicity should stay within its own. You don't marry black to white and all this, da, 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 da. That's not what's going on here. So that's not what's going on here, and I'm not saying that. And that is a stretch of belief system that people have because of what I just said, and that's their own ignorance. That's not what the Bible's teaching. It's not teaching that you shouldn't marry a different ethnic line of people. What they're talking about is the ethnicity of the Jewish people was unique because they were God's called people. So God's people being called were to remain in their own kindred. Speaking of the issue of faith, because God measured faith back then by what? By a people he called by his own name. And so today, the people of faith are in spirit. So your ethnicity can be, who cares what it is? Your ethnicity could be all kinds of different variations of ethnicity. It's irrelevant. What's relevant is the Spirit of Christ in one's life. Does the Spirit of Christ resonate in one's life to be commensurate with your Spirit of Christ? Meaning, not just the belief in God, oh, nay, nay. The belief in God that says, I want to live to know and serve him in a way that deepens in my life. And if I marry someone who just believes in him, but doesn't want to serve and get to know him, that's unevenly yoked. And that's what he's talking about from here. And the kindred, you marry within your own kindred, because back then the kindred was defined as the line of the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's your lineage. That's your kindred. Whereas over in today's New Testament world, it's of the spirit. Back then it was of the flesh. And so that's why you have different aspects. But that's the premise God was pointing out, not the fact you shouldn't intermingle with different ethnicities. Back then it was a big deal, because that's how God defined his people of faith. Because you had to proselytize in. But by the way, there was exceptions, wasn't there? Because you did proselytize in. Did you not? Yes, you did. Did not Joseph marry Asenath in Egypt? And she proselytized in. Did not Moses marry a non-Jewish person? Yes, he did. Did not Solomon? Yes, they did. But they did it from different reasons, different situations. But I would argue totally that Joseph was a type of Christ, and he married in a non-Jewish bride, but because she became a proselyte to his God. Just like he's a type of Christ, and Christ married unto us, the bride and the bridegroom, and we are non-Jewish people, or a mixed multitude. So when you are proselyte into the kindred, that's okay. But when you're not proselytized into, that's not okay. God made that clear too. Even in the Old Testament, God made it clear. Kindred is number one. Only exception is if that kindred becomes a proselyte of our belief and faith, and then we can marry into them. Otherwise, no. That's what Ruth represents, right? She's a Moabite. Think about it. So yes, you could come in as long as you proselytize into the God of Israel. And Ruth proves that demonstratively in the book of Ruth, the opening chapter. Yes?
Ham said, I've got a note that Heth was the Hittites.
That's correct, yes. I didn't mention, yes. And that's the reason why, yes. And that's the reason why people say that Heth is a name we give to the Hittites. Thank you for pointing that out. And that's the reason why later on people also would assert that Zilpah and Bilhah were servants of the Hittites, because she was concerned that Jacob would take the servants of her brother Laban, because they say she knew that the daughters of Heth concerned her because she knew Laban, her brother, had servants of the Hittites. And she knew that that's where she was going to send Jacob to, so she knew that that was going to be a potential reality. That she was concerned about that, you know? So that's what, yes, great point. Thanks for bringing that up. That's why Rebecca had concern. Not because they were just arbitrarily just the people being mentioned, because they were servants in Laban's house, where Jacob was going to pick up both his wives, right? So, or have a wife, as far as Rebecca knew, not many wives.
But Rebecca had the seed on her.
Yeah, well, yeah, she wanted him to fake being, of course, Esau. So,
And about Japheth, I mean,
yeah.
he just seems to be on a shelf somewhere. What's
Yeah.
going on with Japheth and all of this?
yeah, Japheth is, here's another thing, we'll get to, so I don't know why Japheth is shelved, other than the fact that it kind of speaks to the rest of us, Gentile people, being an outlier until really you don't see much of, but you see the Hamite line and the Shemite line kind of battling it out. And the Japheth line comes in.
The tents of Shem.
But you find that, right. So I think the Japheth line comes in later on through the kingdoms of the Babylonian, the Assyrian. I mean, the Syrian wasn't part of the image, but they came before Babylon. So Babylonian, Medes and Persian, Greek. So Greek and then Roman, some of that comes into where Japheth line. So I think Japheth's line is not mentioned, because he doesn't come into play with interacting with Israel until much later, on a wholesale basis.
Split off when the continents got split.
I don't know. It's a good question. I've asked that same question. You find some of Japheth's line, one would argue some of these ites were involved with some of the, but even if you do want to say some of Japheth's line was involved in the interactions of Israel's battles, it wasn't dominantly. It was dominantly the Shemites versus the Hamites, almost all the time. And where you have Japheth's line was kind of the outlier. They came in later on, which is interesting. So, but I don't know. But here's the question about also in Shem's line, when you go into chapter 11 and verse 11 of Shem's line, remember we saw in the King James, he leaves out Canaan, but yet in the Septuagint, Canaan is mentioned, as in C-A-I-N-A-N. So Canaan from is out of, in Genesis 11:11, so he is there in the Septuagint. But when you take his birth, that's what the Septuagint tells you about him. So we're going through this process of now we're off the ark. We're in 33:44. So right here, see the ark. So the flood occurred 33:44. So now we're on 33:43 when Shem is 100 years old. And then he gets Arphaxad, it says in chapter 11, verse 10. And then Shem begat Arphaxad 500 and years. And then Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years. Then Arphaxad lived 135 years and begot Canaan. So basically 100 plus another 100, or excuse me, plus another 135 here, plus, so you got to add another 135 here. So if I subtract this from this, so I got 33:43. What's that, Miss Math major? So there you go. So 33:43.
32:07, I guess.
Is that right? 32:07. So you're going to subtract. So you got to subtract, not minus. So minus subtract that. So it's 32:07 BC. Is when Canaan was born.
32:08.
Oh wait. Okay. Thank you. That's when Canaan was born. Now, the interesting part about Canaan being born at this time, why am I pointing this out? Because I'm trying to figure out the reason. Why was he left off of the genealogy? Because everybody has their own thoughts on it. They say, well, it was a scribe error. I don't go with that. Sorry. When he's in the New Testament, in the book of Luke, in chapter, remember, to remind you, people say it's just an Old Testament issue. No, it's not. Nice try. So in the book of Luke, to remind you, to always go back to what we know to be true. So in the book of Luke, in chapter 3, and verse 37, he's mentioned in the line going up to Jesus, and going back to Adam, and he says, son of Methuselah, son of Enoch, son of Jared, son of Mahalalel, son of Canaan. So it's right there. So he's in that line in Luke 3:37. So I'll put this on the side to remind you. So again, he's in the New Testament as well. So here's an interesting thought. There are some people that think that Shem established Egypt, and that Shem is actually King Menes, the Egyptian pharaoh. I don't think that's true at all, because Shem was before King Menes, and I don't see that happening, but it would possibly make sense. Is this why Canaan was removed? Was Canaan, because he was born, he lived, what's it says? It lives. Canaan lived, and in verse, chapter of Genesis and the Septuagint, from verse 12, and Arphaxad begat Canaan 400 years and begat, and Canaan lived 138 years and begat Selah, and Canaan lived after he begot Selah 330 years. So Canaan lived 330 years, plus so 130 plus 330, so he lived 460. Is that right? Yes. 400 years, yep. Canaan lived 130 years and begat Selah, 130, plus 330, so 460. So Canaan was born and lived 460 years. So if he lived 460 years after 3208, and then you have King Menes in the history of Egypt, if King Menes was in 3100 BC, is it a viable option that it could have been Canaan? Well, yeah, could have been. I'm not saying it is. I don't know. But it makes me think that, is that why Canaan's left off of the line later on? So when the Septuagint has the original text, it writes him in there. Later on, when they're putting the King James together, which is centuries later, because the original Hebrew text was lost, so the Septuagint is important for context, maybe they were thinking, you know what, why should we leave this in there when he was the guy who started Egypt, which we know was the antithesis of causing us slavery? Let's leave him out. Was that true? I don't know. But could he have been the first king of Egypt, which one was viewed by Hebrew people later to be an anathema? Like, remember how the Pharaoh said about Moses, strike him from the record? Remember that? Remember, strike him from the record, let his record books be stricken, let him not be relevant to Egyptian history, that Moses was not in their history. That's why if you read about Egyptian history today, they don't mention Moses. They don't want to have any reference to that stuff, right? So what happens if, in like kindred, the Hebrew did the same to Canaan? What if later on, I don't know all this, I'm just putting this out there as conjecture. As conjecture, what if later on the Hebrews who put together, the people put together the King James were looking at Hebraic writings that were old, they were more recent than the older Septuagint writings, and they said, you know, looking back, we don't want to put Canaan's name in there because he became, in our knowledge, that he became the first ruler of Egypt, which we know became a country that was the pain in our side. They're the ones that put us in slavery for 400 years. We don't like them too much. So let's leave him out. Maybe. I don't know that, but I find it interesting. Some people think that, and this is interesting because this year here that he was born and how long he lived, he could have easily fit that mold. He could have easily fit that mold of, after 100 years, gone down to Egypt and become that guy. And you could see how he'd be then ostracized and left out of the line because he deviated. Was he the first one, in other words? Was he the first one that deviated from the line of Shem to marry into the Hamites? Was he the first one? Many think he was the first one, and that's why he's exited out. He was the first one to do that. And so I don't know that, but it's an interesting thought to think that is that what may have happened? Did Canaan get left out of the genealogy because he, in fact, was the one who was the first Shemite to marry into the Hamites? And not only that, began the first civilization we know, that was Egypt, which became the thorn in Israel's side, which was the impetus of why you have an Exodus. Because Egypt was treating them evil, wicked. As God says, there will be sojourners to serve and be afflicted by them 400 years.
His name sounds like Canaan of Ham.
I know it does. And so it's just interesting. I think that's an interesting thought. I don't know if that's true, but I find it extremely interesting that it may be. It would not surprise me that if we found out that it was true. I don't know that. I just think it's conjecture that I wanted to bring that up. Interesting, viable reason why his name was left out. Yes?
Vicki has said, first of all, why does the Septuagint change the name from Canaan, verse 12, to Canaan in verse 13? This first spelling is Cainan, and why is it changed to Canaan? And then Vicki said, actually, it is all in verse 13.
I don't know which one you're reading. I'm reading from this Septuagint, the red one. This one that's written by Shekinah Glory. Shekinah, what's it called, right? Shekinah, I said Shekinah Glory. Sorry, it's from Shekinah. From this, when I'm reading this, it's rubbed off. I can't read it no more.
And Todd said, actually, Vicki, I have the spelling as Kainan.
Correct, that's what I have. That's what I was going to say. In verse 12 and 13, his name is the same, spelled both. Every time it's the same. To your point, it's a K. So it says Canaan, or you have the K.
And he said the same in verses 12 and 13.
Yeah. You may have the newer, you may looking at the newer version maybe, which is the one that's a black with the red. If it's an all red book, Septuagint, it'll say Canaan. If it's the black with the red, you may have both of what you're looking at maybe. I don't know, because in my Septuagint it doesn't do that.
And Vicki said, I apologize, the Greek side is the same, my bad.
That's all right, it's cool.
It looks like his name's almost a combination of Cain, of Cain and Abel, and Canaan of Haman.
Yeah, that's interesting. Nancy just pointed out, I never picked it up. She thinks, so Nancy just pointed out that is it a combination of Cain and Canaan? It's like this is a combination of both their names. So is that a combination of both their names? Which is, it does look that way, doesn't it? So that it does look that way. I never put that together. That's interesting because you have two earmarks of peoples. One that when the world was first restored, he led the way down south. And then he's the production. He's the offspring of that which was the curse. And then you have here the same way. It's interesting. So is that why? And
Like the first giant and the worst giant.
Yeah, the first and the worst giant is pretty, yes.
Todd said Shekinah Enterprises is my version.
Thank you, that's what I meant, thank you. I couldn't read it because it's erased. Yeah, Shekinah Enterprise, okay. So the reality is that within this context of what we saw so far, I just wanted to make sure I put that supposition out there that would that have happened, who knows if that was the case. Then I want to continue to go forward on this timeline. If you start adding together, so what I did is I put together the years, and I added this. There's a lot of different math on this stuff. But let me find the right chart. Okay, here it is. I have so much math I got to share with you today. So, all right, so when you have Shem being born in 3444, well, how do we know that? If you remember, here's the interesting part. See, if you start with the world being 4,000 BC old, and you're saying the earth is, and you're saying from Ha-Adam to now, if you're saying from Ha-Adam, Adam and Eve to now, is 4,000 plus the timeline when Jesus came, and you got 2,000, that's most people's thinking. But remember something, if that's true, then this doesn't make any sense. That what I'm saying is wrong, right? The flood can't be in 3344 if in fact we have Shem being born in 3444, then you got to add 500 years to that. That means that Noah was born, going backwards, Noah was born in 3944. He was 500 years old, remember? That if I go back, and you go back in the scripture and you find that the Ha-Adam, or the Adam, he had died 126 years prior to Noah, and Ha-Adam lived 930 years of age. So if you add 930 and 126 together, so 930 plus 126, and that equals 1,000, what is that? I can't do my math. I'm challenged. 1056, right? So 1056 right here makes that 5,000, which means goes back to, so it began, so man began in 5000 BC. So, but if you say 4000 BC, then you got some explaining to do, Lucy. Then how do you get 930 years for Ha-Adam, who died 126 years prior to Noah, who then 500 years later had Shem? You got some issues, man. I'm just telling you, you got some major issues there that you're missing. And so you can't get that, right? And then, so what happens is, this is a big thing to help you follow what I just did there. And if you want to go back to the line of Ha-Adam, I can go back and show you about that, which we did before. A lot of stuff here, a lot of paper, a lot of stuff. All these red notes I have, it's unbelievable. Okay, so if I go back, where is my stuff? All right, so if you go and add these years up, all you have to do is just, you figure out by adding the years up from Adam, from Ha-Adam to Noah, just go back to the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5, and you'll find out. We did it before on the board, where Ha-Adam had 130 years later, then there was Seth, and then Seth 105 years later had Enos, then Enos 90 years later had Canaan, and then so on and so on. And all these years add up, and you start adding up how old Ha-Adam was when Noah was born. Well, he wasn't there. He had died 126 years before Noah was born. Then you got to add that, and then you figure out, what a coincidence, that leads you to 5000 BC. But you say, well, all that's malarkey, doesn't matter. Does it now? Because then you add on to the Shem being born, then you got from Shem. So what I want to do is I have to make some corrections on this. Oh my gosh, I've been like, so you know, I've been like really revising this left and right 6 times from Tuesday. That's all the marks. So I had to. So there's some revisions I have to make on this. So I'll put it on the board clearly here for you. So from Adam to Shem, there is actually 1,556 years. So you're going, which is from 5000 BC. Whoop, hello. That's from 5000 BC. Whoops, come on now. 5000 BC to 3444 BC. So that's it. So Ha-Adam was 5000, and then Shem was 3444 BC. That's what that is. Then you have from Shem to Abram. So you have 1,293 years, if I'm not mistaken, yes. Because what you have there is you have Shem was born in 3444. Then you had all the genealogies together, and you're going to come down with 2151 BC for when Abraham was born. Oops. So that's Abram. And then, interesting to note, then from Abram to Joseph, is 251 years. Oops. Come on. Which goes from 2151 BC through, what is that, in 1900 BC. Right? So, and if you look on the side, that would mean that, that would mean that Abram was, if he was born in 2151, and he was called by God when he was 75 years old, according to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, it says, and Abraham in verse 4 went as the Lord, Abram went as the Lord commanded him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old. Okay? He was 75 years old, which means that Abraham was called in 2076. Is that right? So he was called in the year that was 2076 BC. And then, 25 years later, he has Isaac. Then Isaac is born Isaac is born, Abraham is 100 years old, right? So you got to subtract that. So that means Isaac was born in 2051, I believe that's correct. Yep. And then Isaac lives 60 years and gives birth to Jacob, or not him, but Rachel gives birth to Jacob. So Jacob's born 60 years later, which makes him 1991. And then Jacob lived 91 years and had Joseph born, which means Joseph was 1900. That's how you get those dates. So now the situation becomes, now if I start off with 4000 BC, then you got all kinds of problems here. But the problem is that they would take this issue, where is it at? Right here. The genealogy, Genesis 11 in the King James covers 292 years, but in the Septuagint it covers 1072 years. That's a 780-year difference. And therein lies some of the justification they give to kind of, when it comes from this they agree with, not the years, but they agree with the time frame of being that many years. Not the date, though. Here's where they differ. They go, oh, no, it wasn't this many years between. Well, if I think about this, though, so if it wasn't this many years between, then what they do is they shorten it by 780. So now you're seeing why they get to a 4000 BC era, why they say Adam was in the Garden of Eden at 4000 BC. The problem with that is you have ongoing ripple effects of that. So now when you go further on, so if you go to, if Joseph was, so Joseph being who he was, Joseph being at 1900 BC being born, well, it was the age of 17, he's sold into slavery. So if we go to the book of Genesis, you'll see this. In the book of Genesis, go back and look into Genesis. Let's go to here. All I'm doing is trying to track the dates of the patriarchs from the flood. That's what we're doing here. All right, so if you go to, and where is it at here? In Genesis, in chapter, let me see, where am I at? Where am I missing this at? I had it, here it is right here. In chapter 37 and verse 2, and Joseph was a son of 17 years old, and as the lad, he was with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah and so on. So he was 17 years old, so you got that from Genesis 37:1. And then we know he starts to reign 30 years, so that means it's 19, that means it's 17 years backwards. You don't add, you subtract, right? So that's 1883, right? And then he becomes the second in command of Pharaoh when he's 30. So that would tell you that he's age 30, which means that's easy to do. That's 1870, right? You with me so far? Right? And then we know that Joseph lived to 110 years of age, so he actually died in 1790. And so we also know that Jacob, there was a famine in the land. It said there was 7 years of plenty, and then there was 2 years of famine, and when his brothers came in. So they come in 7 and 2 years after this. So Joseph was 39 years old. He was 39 years old when that happened. So they come to see him. He's just short of 40, which is interesting because 40 is number for trial and tribulation. And they come in 1 year short of that before them needing to have food to get back. And of course, we know that was the year he does all their, uncovers himself to them, and Jacob comes and lives there. And so later on, when Jacob dies, that means Joseph was 56 years old. I'm just pointing all that out just for thoughts to have inside how you do all this. But then you got this problem. And I can tell you, all that is all factually based, and the scripture and all that, that's all nice. It's not interpretation, it's all facts. But then you go, well, wait. So there's a problem with a couple of passages we got to look at because, boy, it's convoluted. And I'll be honest with you, it's I thought I had it all figured out. And then I was go back and rechecking it, and I went, oh my gosh, again, with something else I missed. And I go back and I go, okay, so now I'm back to, I'm still in process. So let me share with you a couple of things that I see at this point where we're at. So Genesis 15, and I want you to read in Genesis 15, and you will see in Genesis 15 in verses 12 through 14, or through 15, excuse me, no, 12 through 16. So Genesis 15, 12 to 16. So I'm going to see here, Genesis, put it on the board here. So Genesis 15, verses 12 through 16. So he says, and after going down of the sun of the ecstasy came on Abram, and lo, a great gloomy horror fell upon him, and it was said to Abram, know assuredly that your seed shall sojourn in a land not their own. Now the word sojourn just means to sojourn, to travel through, in a land not your own. Whenever you see the word sojourn, know that the scriptural Hebrew meaning for this is similar to us saying, I went to a trip to, when you guys come down for the conference, you say, I make a trip and we sojourn to Florida. Doesn't mean you live here. It means you dwell here for a time. So a sojourn always speaks to a dwelling for a time. When you use the word dwell, you mean to dwell on a more longer permanency, so that's where you reside. One is to visit or to travel to, and one is to live in. There's two different things. That's why you'll see later on, I'm going to point out in other passages where he says sojourn and dwell. That's what he's talking, the different distinctions. Sojourn is to travel and live temporarily, and dwell is to live on a more permanent basis, right? To make your home. And so he says, knowing assuredly they shall sojourn in a land not their own, meaning it wasn't meant to be their home, was it? No, right? And he says, and they shall be enslaved, well, this is interesting, enslaved and afflicted and humbled. So three things happen. Now, in the King James, if you read Genesis 15, he says, he doesn't say it like that. So in verse 15, he says, let me see, let me read it. He says in verse 13, and knowing of surety your seed will be a stranger. Stranger is sojourner. That's what that means. It's a traveler. And a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict or humble them 400 years. But in the Septuagint, he identifies that they shall be enslaved and afflicted and humbled. So there's three things that happen. So he says they will sojourn, which is a temporary status, a traveler. And he says you will serve, you'll be afflicted, and he says you'll be humbled. That's what he says, right? I didn't make that up, right? So he says that. He says a land not their own. So this is a land not their own. And land not their own. This is the first time he says this about the whole mystery of the Exodus that we know about going forward. So let's read again, keep reading. And he says, 400 years. 400 years. And but the nation or the ethnicity which shall serve I will judge. And after that they shall come out hither with much wealth. Now, without knowing that at the time, that sounds like the Exodus, right? Because that's what it is, right? Thou indeed shall go unto thy fathers in peace, shall go to thy fathers in peace, having been nourished in a good old age, and in the fourth generation they shall be brought back hither. For the sins of the Amorites have not yet come to full. So, remember how he says the sins of the Amorites. Interesting. So it's almost as if the sins of what Jacob did, marrying into the Zilpah and Bilhah, were some of the reasons and groundswell impetus of why you had slavery in Egypt later on. So God just tells you right there. He says, and then the sins of the Amorites have not yet come to full. So you're tying in sins of Amorites to slavery in Egypt. I didn't do that. God just did that. So why would he do that? Unless the Amorites have something to do with Israel. Well, they do. Because we know that Lot, out of his kin, came the Amorites. And we know that they had obviously married into them at some point. But you have this aspect that we know definitively Rachel was concerned about the Hittites, so Jacob's servants were more than likely Hittite, which means later on, other sons of him probably married into Amorites as well. And that's why he says, this is going to come to a fruition. I'm going to say enough. And I got to make a distinction, as he said in the book of Exodus, between the Egyptians and you. And if you're going to be no longer full-blood Jewish, you got to be a proselyte and live like us. Remember? God said that statement in Exodus chapter 12. Yes?
I thought Lot's son was Ammon, and they were Ammonites, not Amorites. Ammonites. That's what I thought. Ammon and Moab.
Oh, wait a minute. Am I saying Amorites? Is that, yes,
Amor.
correct.
Yeah, it's Ammon, A-M-M-O-N was the.
Correct. Sorry, that's my mistake. Thank you for catching me on that. So Ammonites versus Amorites. My apologies. Thank you. So I've tied. Okay. So I've tied in. Sorry about that. I did this before when I was studying. So Ammonites are from Lot. It's Ammon and Moab. And Amorites. My apology. That's a whole different thing from Cain's line. My apology. But here he's talking about the Amorites. Thank you. It actually validates more what I'm saying. So they married into some of those line of people that came from Ham's side later on. They're not tied to Lot though. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me on that. So here he says again that it's a tie-in to, and he says this, land not their own, and again, he says in verse 16, it has consequences linked to Amorites. So this slavery in Egypt has a consequence that's linked to the Amorites. God linked it. We didn't link it. God did that, right? But he also says in the 4th generation. Now I want you to see, so the 4th generation, he says. So if he says 400 years, right? This is where we say, well, then the generation is then 100 years. If he says the 4th generation, he says 400 years, well, then that's, generation is 400 years, right? So, but that's Genesis chapter 15. Now let's go forward a little bit, and let's go back into Exodus chapter 12. That's Exodus chapter 12. I'm taking from Noah's Ark time frame, and all we're doing, I'm just going where the dates lead me at this point. I'm not imposing anything of my own beliefs. I'm not imposing any of my suppositions, none of that stuff. I'm just taking from where we left off at and then carrying the story going forward and seeing how God is making interesting note about what's going on later on. So here we have this. So in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40, I want you to read this. Exodus 12 verse 40 and 41, he says, now the sojourning of the Israelites, which they and their fathers had sojourned in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan. Now, in the King James doesn't say that, does it? It doesn't say and in the land of Canaan. And the King James, it says, and I'll repeat what it says, in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40, it just says, now the sojourning of the sons of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. The Septuagint says, now the sojourning of the Israelites, which they and their fathers had sojourned in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years. Interesting. So it's important to understand when you're looking at this piece of it. So he says 430 years. Then he says, and at the end of the 430 years, all the hosts of the Lord came out of the land of Egypt. So now he adds some flavor to it. So from Genesis, so I'm going to go here. So in Genesis, Exodus, not Genesis, Exodus, in Exodus 12:40, he says sojourn. He said they sojourned in Egypt and Canaan 430 years. So that's interesting. So he adds in two different things now. He adds in Canaan and an extra 30 years. Okay, that's interesting, right? So let's have that. And then as you continue to read on, I want you to go over to, when you go, let me see here. There's another one I wanted to see here. Yeah, so on the left side of your margin, going back to Exodus 12, oh, sorry, gosh. On Exodus 12:40, where he says, it says here in the first verse, sojourning of the sons of Israel who dwelt in Egypt. So it says sojourning, thank you, my apology. I left this out. He sojourned, he says, and dwelt. Well, let me put the words so you can know. So the sojourned, I got to write this out here. So the sojourned is the word for moshab, which again is a temporary dwelling. and he says dwelt. This is Exodus 12:40. And then he says that's Yishab, which is more of a permanent dwelling. So that's more of a permanent dwelling. All right? So then he says, it means you remain. So this is Exodus 40 and 41 to be. But he also says Egypt and Canaan. And he says 430 years. So when he did in Exodus, he adds a couple of more details that were not in Genesis 15. He adds sojourn and dwell. Then he adds Egypt and Canaan. And then he adds 30 years to the 400. So that's interesting, right? He adds those things. Then, as you continue to go to 1 Kings in chapter 6, what we're trying to do is figure out from here, where does this time land us when it comes to the Exodus issue? So let's go to 1 Kings chapter 6. And in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the sons of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of the Solomon's reign over Israel." Now, wait a minute. Septuagint doesn't say 480 years. It says 440 years. So you go to 1 Kings chapter 6. Go to 1 Kings chapter 6, and you will see. And what you're finding out is, this is why you have so many different dates about the Exodus. I'm just proving to you why that is. Because of these little factoids, we're going to get to the gathering of facts now. When you try to put them together, you're like, what the heck does this mean? It doesn't seem to fit. And so when you look at it, fits somehow, but it's still kind of, it's interesting how God did it. So you go over to chapter 6 of 1 Kings in the Septuagint. The first verse is actually in the paragraph before chapter 6. So 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 is actually in the paragraph before it at the end of chapter 5. And it says, "Now in the 440th year of the departure of the Israelites out of Egypt, and the 4th year, the 2nd month of King Solomon's reign over Israel." So you go, wait, whoa. So people differ on when Solomon reigned. They say Solomon reigned at different times, and they say, well, he reigned at 970 BC. And some say, no, he reigned at 911 BC. So which one did he reign? When did he begin his reign? When did he begin to reign? So this is the issue right here. I'm still searching this out, to be honest with you. I don't have an answer yet. I know I originally said 911 BC. People say 970 BC. You know why? Because they go, okay, he began to reign 970 BC, and they go 4 years into his reign. They go to 966, and they go, okay, they go 966, and they add 430 years to that. And what happens is they go, okay, because 4 years in it says to his reign, right? So that'd be 966. They go, okay, 966 plus 430 years gives us an Exodus of 1396. That's what they think. So they base it on. So they base it on that. But here's the thing I want you to see. He says here that in the 430th year, 414th year, the departure of the Israelites out of Egypt, left side of your, and then they accept this in the King James, he says the 480th year, but he says after the children were come out of the land of Egypt. It says after. So what's interesting is it's afterwards. So now we go to 1 Kings 6:1 is this is 430 years. No, excuse me. My apology. 440 years in the Septuagint. And it's 480 years in the King James. All right? But it's in both cases, it's after they came out of Egypt. And herein lies the question. When does the 430 years start? Does it start when they came out from the Exodus? Or does it start when they entered the Promised Land? Because what is he counting from? He says after. Does he mean right after? Or does he mean afterwards when they came into the Promised Land? What's he referring to? And that's people's question is, and it's really interesting, because remember it says there were 430 years in Egypt and Canaan. Well, wait. If you're only counting the slavery in Egypt, then where does Canaan come in? And what is that about? You know, were they wandering, the 40 years of wandering, does that count into that? And so you have a lot of this ambiguity there about what's going on, because no matter what you do, the dates seem to always, they don't seem to fit co-gelling. Something's missing that I can't see. Yes?
Todd asked, why does it say 430 years in Exodus, but in Genesis it says 400 years?
In Exodus, God's counting. Okay, great point. My first supposition to you, I'm going to get to that right now. So first I want to gather the facts. The facts were gathered first. I want you to show. There's one more fact I got to gather before we go to the answer to that question.
He said, I think you just answered it.
Yep. So first king, because one's not counting Canaan, that's why. So if you count, and also not counting some other things as well. So if you count, so in Genesis 15, 12, and 16, it says 400 years. Exodus 12, 40, and 41, it says 430 years. 1 Kings 6:1 says there's 440 years in the Septuagint, or 480 in the King James. But either way, it says after this. After that, they came out. It doesn't say right after. It just says after. They came out of Egypt, right? And it's in the 4th year. And the 4th year, which was, let me see, which, again, come on, Preston. Come on, right, nice. Which was the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So, so the question is, if it's 430 years after they came out of Egypt, which then aligns with the 4th year of Solomon's reign, the question is, from when does he start counting the 440 years? I'm going to go by the Septuagint, and the reason why the Septuagint has already shown its accuracy on years over the King James. I don't go with the King. When it comes to the years, I go with the Septuagint because it's an older book of text. It's an older text. And so it's already proved itself valid with the issue of the Canaan genealogy and the book of Genesis, where it's validated in the book of Luke. I need no other validation than how a man's name is being used in the genealogy of Christ. That brings me enough validation to know that Genesis and Septuagint includes a name that the King James leaves out. And then you have the years also that is left out of the King James. I think here I go with the years of the King James, of the Septuagint all day long over the King James. So I'm going to say it's 440 years after, but when do you start the after? So the question is, when does the after start? When do you count? When do you count 430 years? From the Exodus? Or from the entrance into the Promised Land, which was 40 years later. What do you count? So that's the question. No, it's 440 years. So that's what you have to do here. You have to figure out where you counting from, because I think one of those is true. So then you have the other question, the statement that Paul makes. So go over to Galatians in the New Testament. So Paul makes this statement. We've studied this out already in the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 3. And for the context, he is reading in chapter 3, verse 16, and now to Abraham, where promise is spoken. And It says, spoken even to his seed, and does not say, and to the seeds as concerning many, but as concerning one, and to thy seed, who is Christ. And this I affirm that a covenant engagement, which is a previously established, ratified by God, the law issued 400 years and 430 years afterward does not annul or so invalidate the promise. Now the promise, he said, the key phrasing here in Genesis 3:17 is two things he brings up, or Galatians, 3:17. In Galatians 3:17, there's 430 years later. He says, from the promise seed, which was ratified, which means with blood, which means it was a testament, not a covenant. Then he says, unto the law. Right? That's what he says. He says, unto the law. Yeah. So the promise that he's talking about, if you go back to Genesis and you go back to Genesis in chapter 22, back to Genesis chapter 22. So we're going to go here. And Genesis 22, it's the sacrifice that he gives unto Isaac. And this is where Isaac was about 30 years old in Genesis 22. But here you see the issue where you go over into the sacrifice. And then as you go into verse 12, he says, and lay not your hand on your lad, upon the lad, neither do anything unto him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing thou hast not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And he says, and Abraham lifted up his eyes in verse 13 of Genesis 22. And behold, a ram was in the thickets by the thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram, offered him up as a burnt offering. There's your blood sacrifice. And the stud of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, Yahweh Jireh. God will provide. And the mount of the Lord, it shall be seen. It says, and the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of the heaven the second time. And said, by myself I have sworn, said Abraham, or said the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and not withheld your son, your only son, that in blessing I will bless you, and in multiplying I'll multiply your seed, as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand of the seashore, and as the seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations be blessed, because you obeyed my voice. Now, it seems like the promise by blood, according to the seed, happened at this point, which if that's true, then you got to take here that if that's accurate, what he's talking about, if he's talking about from Genesis 22, verse 17, then that would mean Isaac was, how old? Isaac got two S's, right? Is it two S's and one A? Is that right? Isaac? I-S. Yeah. So Isaac was about 30 years old, which means it was 2021 BC. But if that's true, you go, wait a second. If that's true, and he says there's 430 years from there, well, that's interesting. So 2023 minus 430, that's 1593. That doesn't seem right, does it? So 1593 doesn't seem right. So that gives you, so you got 430 years. If that's the case, you got 1593. You got that. Now, is that true? I don't know. Here's the question. When you start adding these up, all these different passages that are being said, that's one. I'm not saying this is the answer. I'm saying, is this one option? Because if you're going to believe it's Genesis 22:17, then you got to come down with that's the date of the Exodus. Because God gave the law to Moses when they came out, right? So right? So then you got a major problem with this. That doesn't gel at all with Solomon's reign, at all. Doesn't even come close. That doesn't. You can't even get to that. So you have a problem with that. So I thought I had the answer to all this until I started reading more, and the more I didn't want to force it. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to bring forth what God has given me. I'm just going to show you what I've seen so far. And I'm still in a quandary as to what's going on. But we're not done yet. There's some more information. So let's go more. So now let's go back to Joseph and his time when he was in this state. So far I'm trying to show you, if I go backwards from here, I'm at 1593, and I'm telling you that's too early on the timeline. The exit had to happen later. Had to. But then over here, you have, if I go 400 years, well, then I still got to account for this 30-year issue. Paul just accounts for it right here. So unless, the only time I can see something different here, when he says, previously ratified, left side of your margin, he says, concerning that, he says, after. See the left-hand side of your, back to Galatians 3:17. Galatians 3:17, that word is used again. So when he says, this is what I say, covenant ratified by God, which is a testament, that after 430 years having become a law. So again, here he goes, this after, not unto, but after. So when? When is after? So he says, after this was done, then the law. So is he saying there's 430 years from this to this, or is he saying after this was done, then something else happened, there was 430 years later, then there was the law? There's a lot of, I hope you hear what I'm saying. It's a lot of interesting. So this to me, when he says the word after in Galatians 3:17, this cannot be the answer. I'm going to leave it on there. I'm just going to present it to you. This is not the answer. This can't be the answer. It just can't be, because it doesn't make any sense on the dates. Not even close. So he says after, then there was, then there was the law. So after what? So there could be a space of time here, is what I'm saying. There's a space of time prior to starting the 430-year count. Then you have this problem. When he says 430 years and God says 400 years, wait a minute. If we're going to use God's calendar and God's numbers, then we should use the same thing when God says 430 years. Moses didn't write that on his own mindset. He wrote what God told him to write. Paul didn't write that. Paul wrote what God told him to write. So if I take 430 years, wait a second now. If I take 430 years and I'm dividing it by 360 days in a year, well, then I'm going to get 154,800 days, which is actually equal to 423 years. All right? Then if I do 400 years by the same thing, divided by 360 days, it's going to give me 144,000 days, which equals 394 years. So if you're going to count, if God's going to say there's 1,260 days and half a year, and we're using those, God puts out that number from which we use to calculate a year in the book of Revelation. When God says a number of years, why would he count other than the calendar he uses? It started to dawn on me, like, wait a second. Why would God use a calendar other than the one he's referring to? So when he says 430 years, he means on his counting, not on our counting. So on his counting, 400 years. So that's actually the way we realize it in our BC ages, is 423 years and then 494 years respectively. So that helps a little bit. But here's the issue. Here's the kind of a key points to look at with Joseph, going back to Joseph. So now if you have Joseph, so Joseph, he actually reigns in Egypt from 1870, and he says he dies. He starts to reign in 1870, so it begins right at 1870 BC. If that's the beginning of Joseph's reign, I tracked it through to when Joseph died, and guess what? Joseph would have reigned under 10 pharaohs during that time frame between here and 1790, which means he reigned under 10 pharaohs. 10 of them. According to the Egyptian history, and look at the second Middle Kingdom, you look at, that's what you find out. There was 10 pharaohs during this time, God's ordinal number of completion. But then I think, so that I know, but then the issue becomes more convoluted, because even if I subtract from here, if I start from this point, the key is, and going back to Exodus again, Exodus 12:40, he says, this is where my thought is on this, Exodus 12:40, when God made the comment, I thought, wait a second. He didn't say what, he didn't say all, it's interesting, not only did he say the sojourning and dwelling in Egypt and Canaan, what he also said was the sons, so in the Septuagint, he says it as the sons of the sojourning of the Israelites. Now, this is where the King James is better than the Septuagint, because the names of the Septuagint are invalid, because the names are changed to fit from the Greek to Hebrew. So, and the King James, the verbiage in Exodus 12:40, he says the sojourning of the sons of Israel who dwell in Egypt. So the first person to dwell in Egypt was Joseph. He's the first one to dwell in Egypt. There's no doubt about that. He lived there as a slave, and he was 17. He was sold into slavery, remember? But because it says the word dwell and not sojourn, but it does say sojourn and dwell in Egypt and Canaan and the Septuagint, it makes me believe that the sojourning was when he was 17 as a slave, because he was temporarily a slave under Potiphar's house. The dwelling represents, I would imagine, when he became second in charge to Pharaoh. He ain't going anywhere, especially when he puts down roots and marries Asenath as his wife. So that's interesting to me, why God would use sojourning and dwell, because in that sense, that's exactly what happened to Joseph. He was sojourning in there. He had no knowledge of how long he would be there. He was a sojourner. He was a servant, a slave unto Egypt, and so unto Potiphar's house. And so later on, when he became ruler, well, now you're permanently in Egypt, right? And so one would also argue even further and say, well, wait a minute, that wasn't all the sons of Israel, Israel being Jacob. All the sons didn't dwell in Egypt till 9 years later, when there were 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, followed by 2 years of famine. That was 9 years later when they came in. So many would say, wait a minute, so if he started reigning in 1870, and then the sons of Israel came to dwell in Egypt 9 years later, that would mean they dwelt there in 1861, right? Is that right? 1861. So if you count from 1861, if that's true, well, then you go down from there. You go, okay, so 1861, then I'm going to minus away 430 years. I'm going to get 1431. That's a little closer to the viable nature of when the Exodus could have happened. So if I take 1861 and I minus 430, but actually it's actually 423, excuse me. Remember, using God's numbers. So 1861 minus 423, I get 1438. So by the way, if you're noticing right now, I am totally messing up my statements that I thought the Exodus was 1348. I don't really care if I'm wrong. I care about getting it right. So if that's the case, well, then that equals 1438. Now that is a lot closer. That's a lot closer to what the Exodus viable nature out there of dates people set than what it might be. But is that the real date? I don't know. I don't know. But this is the only thing that, to me, has any viable nature to it that would make any kind of sense. Because it falls, I'm not trying to force anything into anything. This would account for the verbiage where he says 400 years. But why does he count 30? Because I believe that during this time, Joseph was 56 when Daddy died. I think shortly after that, Joseph, of course, died 54 years later after Daddy died. So he was 56 when Daddy died. When Daddy came in, he was 39. Joseph's 39 here. Could it have been that Joseph, wait, watch. 39 plus 30 is what? 69. One short of the 70th week of Daniel, the whole 70th number, which is key to God. Could it have been that Joseph was no longer in power at 69? Was he out of power at 69 years of age, right short of 70? Speaking to the earmark of typology out ahead, where Israel would then always be cut short of that 70th week, which would speak to the 30 years where it says they would serve, be afflicted, and be humbled. Well, they served for 30, but they were afflicted and humbled for 400. Now it makes sense. I can explain that. Or I can say also, they were in Egypt and in Canaan. Well, they were, because the sons of Israel, he was in Egypt, and they were over on the outside regions of the area, which later on, people would justify where Jacob and his other sons came from was the area known as Canaan, roughly roundabout when there's famine. So you have a famine throughout the land. So that would speak to that. The sojourning, again, speaks to when they were temporarily there. That speaks to Joseph's time temporarily, until they all came and dwelt later on. It all kind of makes sense that this might be more than likely what it's talking about. If that's the case, then I'm off myself by 100 years roughly, 110 to be exact, on my Exodus date that I set years ago. I've changed the Exodus date already twice. I thought it was 1446 when I first started studying the things of the kingdom way back about 10 years ago. I looked back at my notes and I'm like, I said that? It was 1446 I said about 10 years ago. And then about 5 years ago or more, I said 1348. And now it's pointing to 1438. So, I mean, I don't know if I ever get this thing right. All I know is it's amazingly crazy. But you still, I'm not saying that's right, because you still have to justify the First Kings passage. Well, if the first, and also you got Paul's writing, what Paul's talking about. What are they talking about? You still have to make this fit. So you have Paul's statement, and First Kings statement has to fit. This 1438 makes Exodus 12:40 fit, checks that box. It makes Exodus 15:12 and 16 fit. I can check that box. What it doesn't fit yet is the 1 Kings 6:1 and Galatians 3:17. I don't know yet on this. And until I get this ironed out, I'm not really going to be 100% backing this year yet. But it strongly looks like that's probably what it is. Unless I got to figure out how these two can possibly, without trying to force anything, fit into this year. But I want you to see where I'm going with this. Because if this is the case, by the way, if that's the Exodus, then that means if Moses was born, if that's the Exodus, if this is the Exodus, if that's true, then that means Moses was born 80 years before that. Because he was 80 when they went out in the Exodus. Which means Moses was born in 1518. Right? Is that correct? All right? Yeah, 1518. Yes?
I just now saw this comment, and this year, Todd said in this year, 1438 BC represents what?
The Exodus, potentially. Could it represent the Exodus? Because that would count 1861, the 30 years, so when he had Joseph came to reign, and then it was 9 years later, it was 7 years of plenty, and then 2 years of famine. He was 39 years old, then the sons of Israel came to dwell in Egypt. So that's when they all started dwelling there, was 1861. So if that's the case, I minus 423 from that to get 1438, which means is that the Exodus? Is it? You see, yes.
Pam said, does this have any effect on our current calendar?
What it does have effect on is this. I'm not going to have time to do it. Next time we're together, I'm going to get through Daniel chapter 9. It doesn't have an effect on our calendar per se. What it does, it has effect on our calendar, yes. From an overarching standpoint, yes. But nothing specifically that I can point to. But I can tell you that in Daniel 9, that's another, these words after, these number issues of interpreting the years based on God's counting, not on our counting, boy, those are huge takeaways. Because when Solomon said, or the First Kings writer says, that after they came out of Egypt, and then Paul writes after the law, those words, it doesn't mean right after. It doesn't say that. There's a word that could mean immediately. It doesn't say that. It says after, which means sometime after. It doesn't. You don't really know what it would, how much longer it would be. Yes.
Todd said, so what happened between 6,000 BC and 1438 BC? And he said, I'm sorry, 4,000 BC and 1438 BC.
So it's actually, remember, that's 5,000 BC. It's actually the Ha-Adam was here at 5,000 BC. It's not 4,000, it's 5,000. So again, because if this is wrong, then you have, and by the way, so some people would say, well, I got the date wrong. I added 780 years difference. Okay, so remember now, if I'm using 5,000 BC, that's how I get to this number. There's no other way to get to that number except for using that, my beginning point of when the man and woman were in the Garden of Eden. If I use 4,000 BC, well then I got to subtract. The only way I'm going to get here to a different number is I have to erase this difference of 780 years. So that means I have to, because I have to add, so I have to take 1438 and I have to add 780 years. The Exodus 22:18, really? Is that what you think? That's crazy. The Exodus was nowhere near 22:18. No. And no one believes that, by the way. No one even says it. Look it up on Google it. Google it. Everybody believes that Exodus is somewhere between the 1500s to the 1200s, somewhere in there. Your range is about from 1500 and change to 1200 and change. You'll find no one speaking of an Exodus before 1500 or after 1200 that I've ever seen. They're all in that range. But if you start with 4000 BC, then you got to then go back to the King James Version, which means you got to ignore the extra years, which means you have to add that 780 years to this, which means that you're at 22:18. You're way off the cart, buddy. You're out. You failed that test. Failure. That model doesn't work. That's a failure model. So the reality is you got to start with 5000 BC. You have to.